Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone who's watching this later on YouTube, and hello, everyone who is joining our meetup today. Today is our April virtual Kubernetes Cloud Native Canada meetup. Really excited to have you all joining us today. We got a jam-packed agenda. I'm one of the hosts, Jason Hattie, and I'm joined by Mike Foster. Let's get into it. So, quick agenda. We're going to do some housekeeping, do a little bit of just make some events, make you know what's happening in the community. We'll do a wrap up of Kubecon EU, which was an exciting time, and we have Archie and Marino to bring us their thoughts. And then, sort of the meat of our meetup today, we have a presentation from two folks from Loft. We have Rich Burroughs, staff developer advocate, and Carl Montanari, solutions engineer, and they're going to tell us about virtual cluster and give us their tips and tricks. And of course, we're wrapping up with a survey, just again give you the ability to give us some feedback on how we run these events and always make them better and better. So housekeeping, just jumping into things. Of course, follow us and stay connected. We have a number of socials, LinkedIn, Twitter, our YouTube channel, which is where this will be uploaded in case you have to leave early. And of course, join our Slack channel. We have a great community there. We'd love to talk CNCF tech, Kubernetes, ask questions, get help, give help. It's all there, and we'd love to have you join us there. Of course, thank you to our sponsors for this year, JFrog and Microsoft. They help give us funds to help do the online, but also the in-person meetups across all of our cities. So big thanks to them for sponsoring our meetup. If your company is interested in becoming a sponsor, there's a QR code in that you can scan, or we'll send the link as well, just to give you more details about what it means to be a sponsor and what you can get out of it. As always, CFPs are open for all of our events. So we have this virtual one that is open, as well as all of our in-person ones: Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Quebec, Waterloo, the Tri-Cities there. So we are looking for folks who want to speak, whether you use CNCF tech or it's your work. We have these longer slots available, but we also are thinking of doing a sort of lightning talk series. So we are looking explicitly for local community speakers or even first-time speakers to give what we call lightning talks, or short 15-minute lightning talks, little short condensed experiences on anything related to CNCF or Cube. And we're looking to do these in a few cities, local cities. So if you're using CNCF tools every day, maybe you've got a cool CLI tool that you want to show off, or you've got a fail story, or you're running something in your home lab, something small or something big, we just want to hear from you. We want to hear from the people that are part of our community. So really encourage everybody to think about doing this. We've done something like this virtually sort of at the very start of COVID, and it was a big success. And it was really great to just hear the stories of everyday users. So we really want to do this again. We are looking to do it in a couple of the cities, I think Montreal, Ottawa, Quebec City, Toronto, top of the list. And so here's the CFP, the paper call link there, and then just drop it in there, and we'll review and be in touch. There's a QR code you can scan as well. That's got all the CFPs linked there as well. Some upcoming events. Marino's on the call here, but we got Cube Huddle coming. It's exciting. Cube Huddle is happening in Toronto at the Metro Toronto Convention Center, May 17th, 18th. We've got a ton of great speakers there, a ton of great talks. Going to cover all sorts of things Kubernetes. Our own Archie is there, opening things up. So please join. Tickets are still available. Check out the link. And if you have questions, hit up Marino, who is definitely being one of the leaders there. Of course, plenty of KubeCons to come. I think in sequential order, KubeCon China is up next, up in Shanghai. That's up in late September there, 25th to 27th. And that's so you can get tickets to that if you are in that region or interested in going to that region. But of course, closer to us all is KubeCon North America. That's happening November 6th to 9th in the Windy City, Chicago, Illinois. So tickets are available there for now as well. I think CFP dates are also open right now. Someone can correct me. But you definitely do want to jump on getting these tickets. It is suspected to be a big sellout, super popular. So if you are able to get your tickets early, and make sure you can guarantee your presence. And last but not least, in the list of KubeCons coming, recently announced, KubeCon EU 2024. That's happening in the lovely city of Paris, France. And so that's happening in the middle of March. Should be a good time. But that's enough from me. Just want to mention the CNCF ambassadors, all the folks that have applied for that process. I've gone through. We have 155 ambassadors came out from that process. 37 countries represented, and 124 companies represented. So a huge representation, number of great ambassadors selected. And of course, we have a few here in Canada. We have Adriana Viala from Lightstep, our own Archie, who represents Google, Kaylin from Shopify, Grace from University of Waterloo, my alma mater, and Mathieu from Human Tech. So Archie has a great sweater. I don't know, Archie, you want to show it up? Your Team Canada sweater. But it's excited to see all these ambassadors elected who help sort of bring the community and link us and make sure that we're in touch with the CNCF. So reach out. Again, there's future opportunities to become an ambassador. So I encourage you, if you are interested in becoming one, there's still future opportunities, and reach out to Archie if you're interested in understanding what that means. But with that, I'm going to hand over the Kubecon EU recap to you, Mike.
To Archie, actually. Archie, you want to kick it off? Yeah, because you were there, obviously big event, and you have some notes to go over for the fireside chat.
Yeah, we were planning to invite more people to this discussion, I would say, fireside chat. So Rich is our speaker, but he is also at Kubecon, so he will be part of this fireside chat. So there was supposed to be, we also invited CNCF ambassadors from Canada, but not everyone could make it who were there at Kubecon. So it's going to be just three of us, me, Marino, and Rich, just part of this fireside chat. Just before we're going to, start with fireside chat, this event was, I think for me, was like one of the most exciting events, maybe because, it was in Europe, first of all. It's been a while that we didn't go to Europe. It was really, really, I think, well organized. It was sold out event. So it was around 11,000 people at the end. So
yeah, Chris said they had a wait list of 2,000.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, the feeling I had personally, because I kind of feel like in North America, we already know Kubernetes and CNCF, it's been there for some time already. But it looks like Europe just got it, oh, there's a Kubernetes. So you just see so much excitement, so many people want to learn about Kubernetes, all the workshops, all the things get started with Kubernetes. It was just people are cramming, want to learn, I want to get my kubectl. So it's I think it's getting to Europe. Maybe we're a little bit ahead of the curve, but we're still excited about the technology. So you can see there was about almost 60% were first-time attendees of the conference, but there was obviously all veterans who is going to all KubeCons. A lot of contributors were there, so that was fantastic. There was also over 5,000 people joined virtually the event. One of the biggest complaints we've heard from community that a lot of talks were not available in virtual subscription, and I don't know exactly the reason why they did it. Obviously, it's hard to stream all the video sessions at the same times, but I think also the goal was let's try to bring everyone in person so we can meet each other. And obviously, people in North America had a hard time to get there, but some of them were able to come, right? So for those people who are virtually and were a little bit upset about this, don't worry, all the recordings coming to YouTube channel shortly. It's been uploading as we're speaking, so hopefully we're going to share in our Slack channel the link with all the video recordings. Next slide. So I personally missed that regex, which was happening on Sunday, and this time KubeCon CNCF Cloud Native Con, the first time what they did, they actually, if you get a ticket for the days, you can actually attend any day that were provided. You could attend Argo and Edge days and Istio days. So it was I think it was a great idea. But I wasn't there, so I'll let Marino share what was happening in that room, because my tickets was only applicable to KubeCon.
Yeah, I'll be real. I couldn't get to every single event out there or even every single talk, but I did end up going to Regex, and I caught Rich there. So Rich definitely has a lot of insights to share about that conference. But it's a fantastic conference, especially since a lot of the greatest talks never ever make it into KubeCon. They end up here, and I love the vibe. The vibe's usually very it's chill. There's not a lot of in-your-face conversations or in-your-face vendors or anything like that. You actually have a real true community conference that happens. It just prepares you for KubeCon. But I wasn't able to get to day 2. So Rich, I mean, maybe you want to share some of your experiences around rejects, and then I'll continue on.
Yeah, I was super jet lagged, and so I didn't actually see more than a couple talks at Rejects. But like I flew in the first day, like halfway through the day. But I did see a couple, and they were great. And I agree very much about the vibe of it. It's such a good conference. The schedule, like if you look at it, was super solid. Lots of really, really high quality speakers and content. And it does make for kind of like a long KubeCon week, if you are there for those 2 days and then everything else. But like if you have the stamina for that, I think it's very well worth doing. It's pretty inexpensive too.
I agree. So because I couldn't make it to day 2, I was running an event with Solo called Application Networking Day, and they focus on some of the key networking technologies in the CNCF space. Envoy, Istio, Cilium, and even does a lot of work with eBPF. I ended up doing Edge Day. I had a talk there, so I was given a talk around edge computing and how you tie that with service mesh. There were a lot of great talks at Istio Day. There were a lot of great talks at eBPF Day, even Linkerd Day. I didn't catch everything, but the interesting thing about the Colo events this year is that while they used to be full day events, they've been cut in half. I think with the exception of ArgoCon and maybe Backstage Con, if I'm not mistaken. So when you think about that, there's a lot of impact that these two communities are having. Argo, GitOps, it's a recurring theme in every conversation that you're having these days. And then the idea around internal developer platforms is another hot thing as well. One thing I probably would say is folks that are getting out to KubeCon in North America for Chicago, definitely go to the Colo events. You'll get some very detailed information around some of these projects that are going on and, the various use cases tied to them. Outside of that, I think KubeCon was a fantastic event. I mean, if you look at this picture here, these are all the different projects that have a high degree of focus from last year into this year, into the years beyond as well. And you're going to notice a shift of more sandbox projects making it in there. A lot of projects will move from incubating to graduated probably within this year alone. I expect KubeCon NA to announce a lot of that. My hope is that Istio and Cilium make it into graduated projects, because that'd be super, super exciting. But I didn't get to a lot of talks actually at KubeCon. In fact, I had to deliver my own talk, or I should say workshop, which is network foundations. So I was really excited about that. But at the same time, I just kind of, to Rich's point, you run out of energy really quickly. And I don't have that level of stamina to keep going. So I just basically spread my time between interacting and meeting with folks and then just being at the booth. And I decided if I needed to catch anything specific talk-wise, I'll go catch the recordings when they're available. Rich, anything you want to share on your end about some of the stuff you've experienced?
Yeah, I was just looking up. I actually wrote a blog post about all this stuff, and I can drop the link in the chat. There's one session I specifically wanted to kind of call out that I thought was really special and people ought to think about watching when the videos come out. And that's Kelsey Hightower did a really amazing session where it was literally just 90 minutes of him doing Q&A with people about open source, about business models, venture capital funding, a lot of really interesting topics. And if you're somebody who where open source software is kind of part of your job, you work for a company that's doing some sort of open source or open core thing or something like that, especially make sure to check that out because he's super real in his answers, and it was pretty fascinating.
We just had him over in Toronto in person.
So that's fantastic.
That was a spotlight for us. Yeah, I think we can move to the next slide and then start, Michael, with the rest. Oh, okay, so that's actually we should have had it. Let's keep it here. I don't know, Michael, you want to take?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I want to leave enough time for Rich to go through. So maybe 5 minutes, 30 seconds. I want to like rapid fire some questions at you, starting with you, Rich. A big announcement that you heard, something that you were a little maybe shocked by, something that sticks out in your mind for an announcement. Maybe it's Kubernetes new release or a new project.
Honestly, I think it was the Paris thing. I mean, that's it's so exciting, that the next EU is going to be in Paris. It's a city I've never been to. And I feel like Valencia last year was good, but like it wasn't a city that I think had the infrastructure to be able to deal with that many people kind of dropping in for an event. Amsterdam was better, but I haven't these last couple of years like booked PTO along with the trip. And if I go to Paris, I will do that for sure. I'll probably stay for like another week after. So that was really exciting, but there were a ton of project updates and things. And yeah, it was super exciting hearing about all the new stuff going on.
We'll have to follow up for some Paris pictures next year. Marino, what stuck out in your mind?
The fact that there's a KubeCon China that's going to happen. And, to Rich's point, like it's kind of a demonstration of how large we're becoming as a massive open source and cloud native community. But if I had to guess and predict, we're probably going to go from 3 KubeCons a year to 4, to maybe even 5, to regionalize them a lot more and allow much more access to these events. Because if you think about it, I think one of the biggest challenges is there were a lot of folks that got scholarships, but they weren't able to process visas in time and make it out there. And I think this is going to make it far more accessible for folks to get out there. And heck, I'd love to be able to go to a lot of different countries I've never been to before. I'm considering China, but then I just began to realize that I've already got another talk accepted at another conference. So I don't think China is going to happen for me this year. There was something else that really stood out to me at this conference. To Archie's point, much earlier on, he said it's like Europe just woke up to Kubernetes, and Archie is absolutely right. Like a lot of these folks that I interacted with through the hallway tracks, they've embraced Kubernetes, they believe in it, they want to take it to the next level. And this conference just felt just right to be able to address all of their particular needs. So I feel like there's going to be a lot more opportunity out that way. You're going to see a lot more people holding conferences of smaller scale, obviously, around Kubernetes in the ecosystem. I expect a lot of the KCDs to come back in full force. Heck, we should even try and get one going up in Canada if we can. But maybe that's why we have Kube Huddle. Yeah, that's what I've got. I mean, there are themes that I've encountered throughout the conference, but anyone else you want to add some color to some of what I said?
I kind of want to kick it over to Archie to see if.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say real quick. The Asia conference actually did exist like before, COVID. So this is the first one that they've been able to have since in China since COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, spot on. We're running close to your demo soon, Rich. So I want to give the last word to Archie. Any big announcements, new projects that you saw that you wanted to bring up, especially as a CNCF ambassador?
I kind of with the folks here, like my son was playing in France hockey tournament, and I was at KubeCon, so I missed all the Paris things. So I'm super excited about Paris KubeCon next year. There was actually some announcement that I found interesting. Obviously, Cilium is continuing, the interesting innovations. So they kind of announced about service mesh. So we have another mesh to look into, I guess. And they were talking about service mesh across cloud, things. So like, I guess, service mesh thing is never going to stop. So it's still becoming a hot topic. And I don't know if it was an announcement, but I kind of noticed like Microsoft is very active with Istio as well. So like, I don't know if they announced it or not, but like they're actually, I don't know what they're going to do with their own service meshes that they put it in CNCF, but I think they're looking into Istio as well seriously to have it in the Azure. So I don't know all the details, but that's what I've heard. So for me, it was like kind of announcements that I really was like interested to learn about.
Yeah, I saw a graph recently, and I'm not sure if it was like at the conference or somewhere else, but it was about like the end user contributions, and Microsoft was like, I think at the top of the list. So they've really been putting a lot of energy into open source stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Rich. I want to make sure that you have enough time. We're 22 minutes in, and I know your demo is coming up. So, if we have extra time at the end of the hour, we can talk more Kubecon EU. But until then, I want to hand it over to you. Go ahead, Archie.
Mike, we should have another 3 minutes. Should be fine. Like that.
All right. I mean, the next question, if you have 2 minutes and you want to keep it quick, what's your favorite memory of the event? What was something that stood out to you? I'll start with you, Rich.
Gosh, I was so jet lagged. I'm not sure how many memories that I have, but I mean,
or
I
lack
think
of
that,
memories, maybe from Amsterdam.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just like not as much one big memory as just like lots of little conversations and being able to reconnect with friends and meet some new people. I think that not everybody is in the position to be able to attend these conferences. Some of us are in roles where our company will pay us to go to these, pay for us to go to these events, and that's a big advantage. But if you're able to make it to like the closest KubeCon to you, I really recommend it. It's a really great way to kind of like build a network like in the cloud native community, and I sort of feel like networking is kind of a dirty word in a way. Like it sort of sounds mercenary, but like there is a way to build a network of people in a very authentic way. It's just making friends. It's just meeting people to collaborate with and stuff. And it makes a really big difference in people's careers. So yeah.
Marino, over to you.
+1 for Rich. Obviously, like I'm always trying to like learn about the country I am. So like being in Amsterdam and going to all the parties, exploring where the party in this canal and that canal, and it was, we went to Heineken Experience, we went to Upside Down Museum, like all of this, like it was just great, and like meeting people, having a good time. I think it was really amazing experience for me, at least, and I'm looking forward for another country like France next year.
We did go to the Rijksmuseum too after the conference and saw like the Rembrandts and stuff, and that was pretty fantastic.
Nice.
So the question was, what's my favorite memory of KubeCon? Is that what it is? Yeah, I have a lot. I have plenty. I mean, honestly, there were a lot of events that happened after KubeCon in the sense of like evening events, and I think those are the ones to just bring to attention, because once you do the conference thing, you get all these sessions and you have a lot of technical stuff going on in your brain, and you're ready to kind of unwind. Yeah, you got to go back to the hotel room, but at the same time you also have to think about, if you've got that bandwidth, maybe go hang out at one of these parties and stuff and just socialize. And that's what I did a few times. I didn't overdo it this time. I actually underdid it, which is a good thing, and left me with some more energy than last year. But there were a few that stood out, right? One was Kubernetes, a really great event around karaoke, bringing folks from the KubeCon world here. And we were all packed in one tiny room, but it was a great night to have fun after the first night of KubeCon. The second one was Kuber Bowl, which another packed event, another great event. Had it at a bowling alley. I think there were easily 1,000 people there, if I had to guess. But it was great. You get to catch up with everyone after the conference, have a chat with them, go drink, whatever it is. And then those are when the ideas start coming out. The ideas don't flow as much when you're actually at a conference, because you're always go, trying to get to the next session, meeting with vendors and sponsors and all this stuff. But you have a beer in your hand, or you have a drink, or whatever your beverage is, and you're chatting, and all of a sudden you have an idea for collaboration, for your next talk, for the next project. And those are some of the best memories I have. I think I've already figured out what I'm going to do for the next half of this year, just because of the fact that I've had these conversations with folks at these events. It's harder to do when you're just at the conference, because you also have to consider that it's exhausting to go from one place to another, and then you have to find time for your breaks. You have to find time to go visit whoever you plan to visit and meet with, and maybe do a podcast or a video or something like that. But once you kind of put everything down, leave your bag at the hotel, and you're out in the evening, that's where all the fun comes out. That's where the how do I say it? What's the word? That corporate feeling wears off, and now you just you can kind of truly be yourself. So that's my favorite memory, like those two events, and just a lot of the meeting people, having those hallway conversations and running into people in the streets of Amsterdam. That's another fun thing to do. Oh, you're going here too for dinner? All right, let's join tables or something like that. So yeah. All right, Rich, it's you. I don't want to take any more time.
All right.
Yeah, Jason, you want to go ahead and introduce them? I think we're getting towards middle of the hour.
Yeah, totally. So thanks for recapping Kubecon EU. That was wonderful. I think I wish I could be there, but let's focus on the hour now. I'd like to introduce again Rich Burroughs, staff advocate at Loft, and his colleague Carl Montanari, solutions engineer, also at Loft. You might also know Rich from KubeCuddle, little podcast that goes around. But other than that, I would like to introduce these two and take it away.
Cool. Let me share my screen real quick. We're going to be, so the way this talk works is that I do a lot of the talking on the slides and Carl does some crazy mad scientist demos. And so we'll be kind of flipping back and forth. But I'm creator and host of the KubeCuddle podcast, as was mentioned. I worked in operations for a long time before I got into developer advocacy. And so I have seen some things.
Right on. And I'm Carl Montanari, developer here at Loft. Sometimes I write good code, most of the time not so much. And yeah, I'll be doing some demo fun stuff.
So things we're going to cover today, some Kubernetes multi-tenancy challenges, what are virtual clusters, some vCluster tips and tricks. And so let's start off with why and what are virtual clusters. So Kubernetes multi-tenancy is hard. And if you've worked with it, you probably know this. There's mainly been two Kubernetes multi-tenancy models in the past, namespace-based isolation and cluster-based isolation. With namespace-based isolation, tenants are restricted to one or more namespaces using things like RBAC and network policies. So some of the pros of this approach, it cuts down on cluster sprawl because you're sharing these clusters. There's less wasted resources because you're really packing in these workloads. But some of the cons, users can't manage global objects like CRDs. And that's not something you want them to do in the production environment. But if this is somebody's dev environment on a shared cluster, you probably want to give them a more kind of admin-like experience. Users may need multiple namespaces, like maybe they have services that need to talk to each other in a microservice environment, and then you end up making like network policy exceptions and things, and it can get really complex to have people running all these different kinds of workloads on the same server. Cluster-based isolation, tenants each get their own dedicated cluster. So some of the pros of this, it's much better isolation. There's less complexity in each cluster because, again, people are just kind of doing like one thing. Some of the cons, it's difficult to manage all these clusters. And there's potentially more wasted resources because, we aren't packing the workloads in. So you may have the thing, your compute nodes may be running at 30%, CPU utilization or something. Want to give a shout out to this talk, which I really love. Holly Cummins did it at KubeCon a few years ago. She used this phrase, zombie clusters, and I really love that. And what that means is a cluster where maybe the workloads aren't needed anymore, or maybe people don't even know that they're running anymore. And these things use power, and that does impact the planet. So here's your choices. Do you want to do the namespace thing, or do you want to do give everybody a cluster? So there's another option now, these virtual Kubernetes clusters. A virtual cluster runs inside of a host cluster, but it appears to the user as if it's a standalone dedicated cluster. And we're going to be talking today about vCluster. It's an open source project that was launched in April of 2021. So it just turned 2 years old recently. It's currently the most popular implementation of virtual clusters by a long shot, I think. It's a certified Kubernetes distribution, which means it passes a suite of conformance tests from the CNCF, and it's really fast and easy to use. So how does vCluster work? The virtual cluster runs in a namespace on a host cluster. So you got one cluster and a namespace inside of it and a cluster inside of that. The vCluster pod contains a Kubernetes API server and some other tools. It saves its state in a database inside of that namespace. It uses SQLite by default, but you can also point it at like etcd and Postgres and some other things. And the vCluster client that you use to manage these things is a really small Go binary. So let's take a look at the architecture a little bit more. So here's a normal shared cluster. It's got the API server, etcd, the controller manager, scheduler, all the normal things in the control plane. As an admin, I connect to the API server of that cluster, and I control the context of it. But I can use vCluster and I can have a user create a namespace inside of there and launch a vCluster pod. And that has inside of it the API server and the data store that we talked about already. It's also got a controller manager, and it has this thing called the vCluster syncer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So as a tenant of the virtual cluster, I'm going to connect to its API server. So if I'm using kubectl or even Argo or something like that, you know, any API requests are going to go to the API server like of the nested cluster, the virtual one. And I control its context. I can create a namespace inside of the nested cluster. I can create deployments, pods, all of those things. And if I create a pod, one thing that you'll notice is that on the vCluster line, the orange line, there is not a scheduler. That's the default state of vCluster. There's no scheduler. And the way that it works is that when you create a pod inside the virtual cluster, the syncer tells the underlying host cluster to schedule that pod. And so it actually gets scheduled, you know, on that underlying cluster. And then there is bidirectional communication through the syncer. So that way, if the state changes, you know, like, you know, on the underlying cluster, the virtual cluster knows about that, and vice versa. So that's the gist of how vCluster works. And I am going to turn it over to Carl here, and he's going to do our first demo.
All righty. It's appropriately named Demo 1. So we'll start at the beginning. Yeah, right on. So just to kind of set the stage here, we've got a K3D cluster, just get nodes and pods here. I can't type very fast here. Just to kind of level set, it's 5-node cluster. That doesn't really need to be. It's just to have something to look at. And there's clearly not a lot going on. And to get started with vCluster, we'll go ahead and just use the vCluster CLI or vCluster CTL, or whatever you want to call it, that Rich mentioned. And this is just a simple Go binary, multi-platforms, obviously install it wherever you need to. And we'll go ahead and use the create command here to, as you would guess, create a vCluster. We'll go ahead and give it a name, my vCluster, very original, I know. And then we're going to tell vCluster not to connect. By default, vCluster CTL is going to want to connect to that API server that it's deploying, either with port forwarding or a node port. We don't actually want to do that for purposes of the demo. We're actually going to set an ingress up to connect to that API server, which is probably more like what you would do in like a production type environment anyway. So we'll kind of go ahead and do that. And we're telling it to do that in the values file that you can see that we're passing there with the -f flag. You might have also seen some outputs. So there's some Helmy things happening. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But for now, we can use the vCluster list command to, as you probably would guess, list vClusters. And because I talk too much, we already have this thing running. If we kind of ran that command a little earlier, you'd see usually about 20, 30 seconds, and we've got a running API server. The only demo magic that's happened here is preceding the image, so I don't have to pull it on my horrible internet. But other than that, this was all real-time live stuff happening. So we've already got a vCluster fully up and running. We can go ahead and then check the ingress. In this case, we just want to make sure the ingress is got an address allocated and we can actually connect to it. So sure enough, that's already done. So we can go ahead and check here. And we'll go ahead and use the vCluster connect command to connect to the vCluster, as you would expect. This time, we're still not connecting to the vCluster directly. We're going to use this command with the update current false to just pop out a kubeconfig. And then now we can go ahead and take a look at the kubeconfig. If you've seen a kubeconfig before, there's nothing very exciting here. The only maybe interesting thing is we told it to go to this service, or excuse me, to this server. That's just a thing an Etsy hosts on my machine, so we can go ahead and talk to it. And then from here on out, it's pretty much normal Kubernetes things because it's a normal Kubernetes API server. So we can go ahead and get pods and nodes and then pods, if I can remember the demo order here. And you can see that there's only a single node, even though we had a 5-node cluster. And that's because by default, vCluster is only going to sync nodes or basically make nodes visible, I guess I'll say, inside of vCluster if a workload is running on them. So in this case, core DNS was scheduled on K3D local server 0, and that's the only node that we see. There'll be more on this later. From there on out, yeah, we're just going to create a simple Nginx namespace and then do a little deployment with a couple of replicas just to have something to look at. Nothing too exciting. This is all pretty standard Kubernetes stuff, of course. Go ahead and get the pods. They're already running. Again, nothing fancy. It's just the image is preceded, but otherwise nothing interesting there. This is where things start to get a little interesting. So in this last command here, we ran kubectl get pods, but we omitted the kubeconfig that we were using before to talk to the virtual cluster. In this case, we're actually talking back to the host cluster. And from the host cluster's perspective, we can see a couple things. So obviously we see the vCluster deployment itself. So there's 2 containers in there. That's what represents the vCluster. That's the API server and the syncer. We see the core DNS that gets deployed into that vCluster, and then of course our Nginx pods. And the interesting thing here is that the names are obviously not what they were when we saw them in the previous example here. They start the same, but then we've got this little separator, the name of the namespace. This is the name of the namespace the pod runs in the vCluster, a separator, and then the name of the vCluster itself. And this is so that we can have multiple vClusters in the same host cluster namespace, and we don't stomp on each other if we both try to deploy Nginx pod in an Nginx namespace. So we do all this kind of translation to keep things from colliding. And that is the basics. So back to Rich.
Very cool. Thank you, Carl. So now into the tips and tricks. These are mainly features that have been added since vCluster launched originally. So these are things that showed up in the last couple of years. The first one is distros. So when we talk about the distro, that's the Kubernetes installed inside the virtual cluster. And that's one thing that's interesting about it is that it doesn't have to be the same as the Kubernetes on the underlying cluster. The default is K3S. That's what we started out with. But eventually people started approaching us and they wanted to use other versions of Kubernetes. So K0S was the first one and we added that. Then we did a stream with the AWS folks, their containers from the couch show that they do. And within a few hours, we had a PR from Justin Garrison adding the EKS distribution. So the actual Kubernetes packages they use for EKS. And there's also what we call vanilla Kubernetes, which is just a standard Kubernetes. And it actually has an etcd and some other things that run with it. Creating virtual clusters, there's 3 ways to do that. We saw the vCluster create command, which is a great way to try it out, but probably not how you're gonna like productionize it, operationalize it, whatever you want to say. There's a vCluster Helm chart, and if you noticed, the vCluster create command actually runs a Helm command as part of that, but you can use the Helm chart directly. And there's now a cluster API provider as of a few months ago. So the Helm install, we mentioned it's used by the vCluster create. It's really great if you're doing something like GitOps. Just wanted to point out really quick that like in the vCluster GitHub repo, there's a charts directory. There's a subdirectory there for each of those distros that we talked about. And there's a values.yaml file inside of that. And we'll be referring to the values.yaml file more. It can be used a lot for configuration. And it's nice to be able to take a look at that, you know, and see just like what the different things are that you can tweak in there. They correspond to like the command line options as well. The Cluster API provider, if you're not familiar with it, Cluster API is used to provision Kubernetes clusters and manage their lifecycle. It requires cluster CTL, which is a CLI for the cluster API. And our provider creates virtual clusters in the local cluster. So whatever cluster you are sending the cluster CTL commands to, that's where the virtual clusters get created. So, if you're using cluster API for other things, this might be a better option for you if that's like your standard way of creating clusters. There is a separate GitHub repo for that provider too, and we'll have some links at the end of the presentation. This is a really quick example of how you could launch one of these things straight from the README. You can see that it runs the cluster CTL generate cluster command with these environment variables. Exposing the cluster, making it so you can connect to it. vCluster Connect uses port forwarding for remote clusters. So, again, if you're just messing around with it, that's a really good way to get started using the CLI. As Carl mentioned, you can use a node port too, and that's actually used by default for local clusters, so you don't have to port forward. So if you're using something like Minikube or Docker Desktop, vCluster will detect that, and it will just set it up as a node port, so you don't even have to port forward at all. And then you can use a load balancer. There's a --expose flag, and you can use an ingress, as Carl mentioned, which is, if you're doing like for real stuff, like stuff closer to production, that's probably what you want to be doing. vCluster inception. This is a trick, not a tip. You could run vCluster inside a vCluster. Even if you don't have a use case for this, it's a fun thing to do. And I am going to turn it right back over to Carl. Yeah, the why is a good question.
Indeed it is. All right, let's share screen again. Here we go. Demo number 2. Maybe. There we go. All right. Yep. So once again, let's just kind of do a quick level set. We can get nodes and we can get pods. And this is the same cluster that we were looking at before, but you maybe notice a couple different things. And based on the last slide being vCluster inception, you might already kind of be understanding what's going on here. Some things that look probably pretty familiar. These 2 Nginx pods that we deployed in the previous example, core DNS, this thing called my vCluster 0, which we just created in the previous example. And then just to kind of show this from a different perspective, if we look inside of vCluster 1, which is actually what we were running in the previous example, this probably looks a little bit more familiar because this is what we saw in the last example. So everybody has been bamboozled. We've lied to you. We created that first vCluster inside of another vCluster just because we can. Again, this is probably not like the greatest use case, or there's probably not too many great use cases for this. Maybe there are. But it is interesting, and you can see that it absolutely works. And you could keep nesting, although again, probably don't recommend that. What's interesting here, so from the context of the first cluster that we were using, the one that we lied to you about, that was actually a vCluster. You can see the Nginx pods got scheduled, and we had the name change translation going on. And then when we actually look at it from the perspective of the real cluster, where we're no longer lying to you, we see that the name gets translated again. So we'll just keep doing that, and then obviously at some point we'll hit like character limitations for names in Kubernetes, of course. And then once we get there, we'll just end up hashing kind of the last little bit here. So you can see this was in the my vCluster namespace, and obviously we kind of shortened things off and got a little bit chopped off there, and then just hashed it out. So the one thing that's really great about vCluster, and I think that we don't talk about this as much as we should, in my opinion, is that when we create a vCluster and we create a bunch of stuff inside of it, that's awesome, and it works, and it's fantastic, and we can do cluster-wide things and operator development and do whatever you want. But one of the great things is that we can also just as easily delete them, and not just delete the vCluster, but delete all of the resources that were inside of the vCluster. So actually, like for doing side projects and stuff, I actually just create vClusters. That way my host clusters never have any cruft, and then when I'm done for the day, I just nuke the vCluster and everything's gone. And so sure enough, we can see now if we look at the host cluster, I'm too slow, so we didn't see anything terminating. But obviously the my vCluster pods are already gone, the Nginx pods are gone, the core DNS pods are gone. So everything was just tidied up really, really nicely. Back to Rich for less tricks, more tips, less tricks.
So the question about how are the things scheduled in the nested clusters is a good one. They're all scheduled the same way. So so if you went like 10 vClusters deep, all of those pods would get scheduled on the underlying cluster, the very root level cluster. Okay, tip number 5 is isolated mode. So when we started off thinking about vCluster, it was very much use cases were like ephemeral environments, dev environments, things like that. But as time went on, people started using it for things that are kind of more real. I mentioned in the chat that the CodeFresh people use it inside of their product. We've seen other people building tools where like vCluster is part of their commercial tool that they offer to people. So we added this isolated mode, which creates some additional isolation for the virtual clusters. You enable it with a # isolate flag when you create the vCluster, or you can do that in the values file too if you're creating it the other ways. It creates these objects, a pod security standard, a resource quota and a limit range, and a network policy if the CNI that you're using supports those. So yeah, just to sum up, this is a way to get some extra isolation if you're in a situation where you don't want, the vClusters to be able to talk to each other. Applying manifest and charts. This is a really, really cool feature that got added last year, where users can apply Kubernetes manifests or Helm charts automatically when a vCluster is created. So sometimes you're in this situation where you create a bare bones cluster and you got to get some stuff on there to maybe bootstrap other tools or something like that, or maybe you just want to configure it completely. You can apply these manifests and charts and specify them in the values.yaml file. It can be just plain old Kubernetes YAML. It can be public Helm charts, or if you have private Helm charts, you can even point it at a Git repo for those, or not a Git repo, a tarball. Plugins are something that we added that basically let you be able to extend the behavior of vCluster. They changed the behavior of the syncer. They're written in Go. The plugins are very flexible. You can do lots of things with them. And there is an SDK. These are not easy to write. We also have a plugins repo that has a few examples. These are not easy to write. And so I'm going to show you something in a little bit that that solves some of the same problems that the plugins do. But there is a way, if you are proficient at Go, where you can make vCluster fit your scenario more. And there is another demo from Carl.
I gotta be quick, running out of time. Go. I didn't have enough caffeine. Let's do it. All right, cool. So on the subject of init things, init manifests and charts, I'm gonna show you a values file really quickly here. Probably everybody has seen some basic manifests, so I'm not going to talk too much about that yet. We're going to go ahead and steam right ahead, but you can see that this is in my values file that I'm passing to this Helm command. This time we're using Helm just for funsies. There's really no other reason other than that at this point. But we could go ahead and use Helm to deploy a vCluster, of course, passing in this values file. And while that's happening, I can tell you that these init manifests that we've deployed, it just deploys a really simple, silly demo app that's more or less a ripoff of the HashiCorp HTTP Echo thing. I don't know if people have seen that one, used it for demos and stuff to just test that you can connect to a pod and it pops out some data. This is basically the same thing, except that it is mounting, it's echoing back something that's mounted as an environment variable. So we'll see there's a secret and all of that we're mounting to this pod that's getting deployed with these init manifests. So for now, we'll just go ahead and keep checking the pods, and then hopefully this is going to come up pretty quickly. Sure enough, we can see we've already got the vCluster running. Now that's creating core DNS inside of it and the demo app inside of there as well. Looking good, trying to go fast. All right, everything's running, fantastic. We now need to just check services very quickly. We'll see that we've got that demo service. There was a service in the init manifest as well. So that's already deployed. That's fantastic. And then unfortunately, this is the part that just takes just a little bit longer usually. We also deployed an ingress, and we just need to wait for that ingress to get an address. And then once we have that, perfect, we can go ahead and curl this thing again, just etc host entry pointing to this ingress, nothing too fancy there. And we can see that it's just going to echo something back to us. Race car, okay, very fantastic. Palindromes are fun. And then what we can do is we want to say, check like where this is coming from. And to do that, we can go ahead and use vcluster connect with the double dash thing here and just send a command directly into the vcluster. So we could basically not have to set up an ingress or port forward or anything like that. We could just do it as kind of a one-off thing like this, which is kind of handy. And sure enough, we see that there's this environment secret mounted from a secret, and then we're passing this argument to the container that says, hey, echo whatever's stored in this environment variable. Okay, good enough. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at that secret and see if it jives with what we think it should be, which we think it should be race car. And drum roll please. Ta-da, maybe. We can see that it is not. It's actually Taco Cat. So what gives? Well, you may have noticed a couple interesting things. There's a question in chat about how I'm typing. I'm not typing. It's scripted. I'll talk about that at the end, I promise. Anyway, we're also running a vCluster plugin here. And we can see this in the Helm values. It's called Prefer Parent Resources. It's just like a kind of silly demo plugin that I wrote that does what it basically says on the tin. We prefer to mount config maps and secrets from the host cluster if that secret exists, as opposed to from the secret created in the vCluster. Why you would want to do this is maybe you would want to have like an admin deploy a bunch of config maps in the host cluster and then just always prefer to mount those. You may have noticed earlier, if we scroll back up a tiny bit somewhere, we saw 3 containers in this vCluster pod, which is not what we saw before, because there's always the API server, there's the syncer, and then in this case, we're adding in the prefer parent resources container for the plugin. So that's where that comes from. And then now that we know the trickery that we've laid in front of you here, we can go ahead and look at the secret, my secret in the host cluster. We can see, sure enough, the value is actually race car, and that's where the value came from in the demo app. So the purpose of this is to just demonstrate that you can obviously do some really interesting things with vCluster plugins. Like Rich mentioned, they're all Go SDK, but you can basically modify how things get synced pretty much in all of the ways. And then, yeah, lastly, I already know because I wrote this thing, we can look at the logs, and yes, we have some log message that says, hey, we're mutating this pod, we're preferring the thing from the parent parent host cluster. Okay, that was as fast as I could go.
Woo, Carl. Yeah, I mean, the sort of TLDR though about the plugins is that they're kind of not easy, you know, like they're because you have to write Go. It is a little bit hard for some people, and we'll talk more about like some of the ways we're trying to address that too. So next feature, next tip is pausing and resuming. So this is pretty cool. It's a really quick way to suspend workloads while preserving configuration. There's a vCluster pause command and a vCluster resume. And the way these work are by setting the replica sets to 0 and the stateful sets to vCluster itself is actually a stateful set. And so if you run vCluster pause, all of the pods for the virtual cluster go away, including the vCluster pod itself. So, you know, one of the really big cool things about vCluster is that you can launch them really quickly and delete them, as Carl mentioned. But sometimes maybe you don't want to delete it, right? Like maybe you want to keep this thing around, but you just want to get rid of the workloads. And so the pause and resume is really, really good for that kind of scenario. Number 9 is high availability. It creates virtual multiple copies of the vCluster components. You know, it works with both the K3s and the normal Kubernetes, the vanilla Kubernetes distros. You specify the settings for this in the values.yaml file. And here's an example of a command line. You basically just tell it what distro to use, and you point it at that values file. So the reason we did this is again, you know, we were thinking a lot about environments, about ephemeral environments, but there's been more, people trying to do more real things with this. And so we figured that we'd make it more HA for folks. Now, I mentioned that the plugins are hard. One of the things that people typically wanted to do with the plugins was to sync CRDs, either from the virtual cluster to the host cluster or vice versa. I think usually it's more from the host cluster to the virtual. You've got an ingress or some other object that you want to share to the virtual clusters instead of having to install it in every single virtual cluster. So we came up with this CRD sync that means that you don't have to write Go. Yay. It's a new feature in vCluster 0.14, which I think is just a release or two back. It allows syncing CRDs in either direction. You define these mappings in a YAML file, and it's still relatively new. So if you do try this and you run into problems, please do let us know. And one more demo from Carl.
Last one, go, go, go. All right.
We're pretty close to the end here, so we may go a few minutes over it, but it won't be too long.
Yep. So talking about HAV clusters, here's a very simple values file to deploy an HAV cluster. Pretty obvious first thing that we would need, enable HA true. In this case, we're also cranking up replicas for all of the things. And there's some other things in there that you might notice, but we'll get to that in just a second. So really quickly, here's an HAV cluster. It's called vCluster 0. There's replicas for etcd, core DNS, API server, all of the things. So it looks pretty normal. But there might be some other things that are happening here as well. So now we can use vCluster list. We see, sure enough, vCluster 0 HA. You might notice, like, it's been running a while. You might notice some other things. And the cat is out of the bag. You have been bamboozled more the whole time. The whole demo, everything has actually been running in a K3D, like 5-node K3D cluster, like I said at the beginning. However, inside of that K3D cluster, we've been running an HAV cluster, and everything that we've done, including the third nested V cluster, was created in the HAV cluster. So things got a little bit bonkers here. We can go ahead and see this we see the my vCluster 2, we've got the vCluster 1, we've got our demo app and all of this. Again, not something that you probably would want to be doing, generally speaking, but it's pretty neat. And HAV clusters are really great. I know we talk about vClusters being like a dev thing or a CI thing or preview environment thing a lot. And that's true. And that's like the core vCluster thing, right? And so it's a really great use case. But we've got lots of customers that are doing real production-y things in HAV clusters. So definitely don't think that it can't also kind of play in that space. But that's it. There's no more lies from me. That's the last of my deceit.
Yeah, and we joke around a lot about the inception thing, but I think there are potentially some use cases, like say that you're in a situation where you have like different departments, you could create a vCluster for the department and then their individual vClusters inside of there, and keep things a little bit more separate that way. So there potentially are some use cases for it. And yeah, we just wanted to talk about some resources. If you want to get started, the biggest thing to remember is vcluster.com. That's got links to the GitHub repo and the docs and all of that stuff. There's the GitHub for vCluster. We talked about the SDK, the plugins, the cluster API provider, the docs for that generic CRD sync feature, the demo repo. And we have a community Slack where folks gather and answer questions. The vCluster maintainers are there, some other folks as well. There is also a vCluster channel in the main Kubernetes Slack, so you're welcome to ask questions there. The thing about that is that there just aren't as many other users in there. Like the maintainers are there, but there aren't as many people. And so there's going to be more people who are around to answer questions in our community Slack. But feel free to ask questions in the vCluster Slack as well. And that is it. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask Jason if you can share the QR code with the feedback. We have like maybe another 5-10 minutes to answer all the questions. for the people who want to jump to the call, like you can go, like everything will be recorded, but I think there's like a list of Q&A that we want to capture. And Jason, if you can put our feedback survey, one of the things that we've added to survey is, while at Kubecon, we realized that even though we have a huge community, and there's like millions of people using Kubernetes today, Kubernetes community and other CNCF projects are looking for maintainers and people who want to join. So like if you're one of them and you're dreaming about to start your career as open source contributor, and you probably already done maybe a couple of pull requests and you want to do this more consistent way, we just ask you to add your name in the survey, like you're interested, and we will try to connect you with the like Prometheus team or Knative team or Kubernetes team, like whatever the project you're interested in. So just like a small ask for the people. And then obviously, please don't forget, we're looking for speakers for Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa meetup, and it's going to be around your end user stories. So you have a prime time for 15-20 minutes to talk about your company's success or failure with CNCF projects, and like please let us know that you want to present, and we will help you to get on stage. For folks in Quebec, we actually doing this event today, and they have over 8 speakers, I think, and there's like a full house event. So we want to also have in other cities similar type of events, and we want to hear from not only from the vendors but also from the end users as well. So we're looking forward for that, and we have nice venues already setting up while we're speaking. So we're looking forward for
For your question, Mohammed, I saw you rough dates. We are thinking somewhere in June, mid-June, but once we get a firm date, we'll send it out. I did want to leave time for the question and answer. Let's see if we can get through these. These are really good questions. Rich, I think if you want to go at your own pace, you feel free to go through the list, or I can read them out for you. Up to you.
I'm not sure that I see the list.
Oh, you don't see it? That's okay. I will read them out then. All right. So from Roy, what are the typical resources, memory, CPU, that the vCluster pod requires?
Yeah, so it's really, so the pod itself, Carl, do you want to speak to that? Do you know more about that?
Yeah. So like default deployment for vCluster, meaning K3S and not HA, generally not too much CPU and like less than a half a gig of memory. Obviously, if you have a ton of activity to that API server, it's going to want to use more CPU and stuff like that. And obviously, if you go HA, then obviously you're going to have more containers and so obviously more resources. But that's kind of like the starting footprint. And you can obviously deploy this pretty quick and kind of get a baseline yourself as well.
Yeah, we have people ask sometimes about like if there's a performance hit too, from having this extra layer in there, and we haven't seen too much of one. The other thing that you sort of get by accident with this is API server federation, because the API server of the virtual cluster is actually able to deal with a lot of the requests. It's only a few things like scheduling pods that get passed down to the underlying API server. And so if you're in a situation where you've got like a lot of people, hitting the API server and that's a bottleneck for you, then potentially using the virtual clusters can help some there too.
Awesome. All right, next question from Money. How does ingress work in a vCluster? Is there a global behind-the-scenes ingress that hands off to maybe a vCluster level ingress?
Yes and yes. So there's kind of 2 flavors here. There's ingress to the API server, which in my case, there's a flag, and I was just deploying an Nginx ingress in front of the API server. Another thing that's probably more pressing for most people is the actual ingress for resources inside of a vCluster. And actually, this is something I forgot to show in the last bit, trying to rush. But in all of these examples that we did, in that actual K3D cluster, no more lies, I'm done lying, Nginx ingress controller is deployed there. And a vCluster has a flag where you basically can say, hey, sync ingress classes and ingresses. And I've had that enabled for all of these vClusters. So if you are a user in a vCluster and you say, hey, I'm going to deploy an ingress, whatever, add the annotation Nginx, whatever, as that gets synced up into the host cluster, it will get synced up into the host cluster by virtue of enabling syncing of this resource. So then from there on, it's like once it's in the host cluster, it's a normal ingress, does normal ingress things with your normal ingress controller.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and that resource syncing is like the thing that we talked about at the end, which is the pretty new feature. So if people do play around with that and have feedback, we would love to hear it.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, it makes sense. So you can have like your main team, your infra team manage the ingress, and that passes down to the tenants. Super slick. All right. Next question from Mohammed: does node selection affinity still work, since the only nodes that the cluster sees are the ones with the workload on it? So I guess, yeah. Does node selection affinity still work as you would expect?
Yes, with caveats. So by default, we only sync the nodes with workloads on it. You don't have to have that. And in fact, some of the ways that we lied to you was by syncing all of the nodes from the host cluster and syncing real nodes. So there's kind of two options here. You can do the only sync nodes where the workloads run, or you can sync all nodes. And then there's also kind of an intermediate level where you can sync basically fake nodes. So you can, I don't know all the things that we fake offhand, but it doesn't look exactly like your real host node, but you do see nodes. But yeah, so if you wanted to do things like that with like kind of steering where pods go, you would just sync all the nodes, and then everything works as per normal because it's all in the host cluster scheduler that's happening anyway.
Yeah, and I guess that's maybe a factor of like how much you trust your tenants, right? Like how much you want to let them see, Carl?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, obviously up to you how to roll it.
Right. It's like a balance of, do you really want your tenants to figure out all the node affinities and things like that, or you just give them a subset that is a little maybe easier to hold?
Yeah, totally. And then I guess while we're on that topic, we have like I think an interesting use case where we have some customers that are doing like SaaS type things where they're provisioning vClusters for like each of their customers. And to avoid the noisy neighbor thing, they're actually provisioning a node pool like that's basically dedicated for each of the vClusters. So then you get like, that's as close as you can get to like real clusters without paying like EKS or GK or whoever for additional control plane. So that's kind of neat.
All right. Next question from Sebastien. How do we decide which distro to pick? What are the operational performances and long-term support differences? I guess alluding to the charge class, and then you've got a couple of distros to pick from.
Yeah, I would say generally outside of vClusters area of concern. So like we default to K3S. It works, it's fine. You can use vanilla K8s, EKS if you're doing Amazon things, but for the most part, like for me personally, I don't particularly care that much or think that much about it. But obviously you can go to check out any of those other distros and see what their support looks like and what you want to use. But
yeah, I think that one thing that comes into play there is the fact, so you can specify a version, right? When you set up a vCluster. And one thing that I noticed in the past is that like there were some Kubernetes versions where there wasn't a corresponding K3S version. So if you did want to use, a very specific version of Kubernetes, like inside the virtual cluster, then that might be a situation where you want to use the vanilla one. So you make sure that you match the version, or at least make sure that the distro you're using supports the version that you want to use.
Got it. Right. Some intention needs to be thinking about, deprecated APIs and resources and things like that. Make sure that, I think I saw a question around pod security policy as an example of that in chat.
Yeah.
All right. Moving along, we're getting down to the last couple here. So thanks for your patience as we go through these. Hope everyone is getting these answered, getting the answers you want. Maybe a quick pause. If there are questions after this, what's the best way to reach you if folks have questions?
You could come to the Slack, or I'm on Twitter. I'm just Rich Burroughs there. That's another way to throw stuff at me. Carl's on there too, I think. I don't know if you still go on there.
Yeah, I'm there. You can find me. I'm probably pretty easy to find.
All right, let's just keep trucking on the questions here. Oliver asks, what happens if you have to restart the vCluster pod? Is there any side effects or anything happen to the workloads when that vCluster pod restarts?
No, generally speaking. Obviously, when the API server comes on, it might re-reconcile things, but that shouldn't do anything in theory, right? That's the idea. And then, because like obviously you won't have access to the API server while it's down. But yeah, all the nodes or all the pods get scheduled in the nodes at the host cluster, and they're just gonna, keep on trucking.
I actually had an interesting conversation recently with someone who is using vCluster, and in their use case, they were really concerned about cost. And so they're actually using spot instances. And he said that he didn't care if they go down, because vCluster will behave the right way when it comes back up. So, yeah.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, huge savings for Spot. So if you can use Spot, then yeah, I can realize those savings.
Yeah.
Sort of on the same thing about durability. Like, what's the upgrade process like? Is there any challenges there when you have to upgrade a version of a cluster, for example?
It's a good question. To be honest, I've never actually upgraded a vCluster in place. Just nuke it and deploy a new one. I know that you can. I've just never done it, so I don't want to lie to people and say pretend like I know the process. But yeah, in theory, it shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a thing that I do very often either. I think that, again, I think that a lot of the use cases that people tend to use this stuff for, like dev environments and, environments for CI/CD or preview environments, tend to be pretty ephemeral, and, upgrading isn't as much of a concern. But it definitely does have an upgrade command, and you can do that.
All right, good to know. Question from Oliver. I think I know the answer, but any plans on creating a controller or operator for vCluster? I think there is one, right?
There is one, yeah, exactly. yeah. So that's the commercial product, Loft. So obviously we're talking about open source stuff, but yeah, that's exactly what Loft does, among other things, lots of other things, of course. But yeah, Loft is about really adding a bunch of ergonomics around vClusters and managing vClusters and multiple clusters and all of that stuff. Lots more, but version.
Yep. No worries. Check that out at loft.sh, right? Did I get that the
Yep.
right URL?
You did.
That's awesome. All right. Let's see here. Any challenges around running vCluster on GKE, EKS, AKS, any of the commercial managed control planes?
Not generally, no. Should just work in pretty much any cluster. Obviously, if you care about having like a matching distro, EKS is the only one of those that exists. But other than that, yeah, we run all of our prod stuff in GKE, so with lots and lots of vClusters. So yeah, all good. And of course, have customers running in all of the clouds, basically.
Right. All right. Rakesh here. What's the debugging look like if, for example, you have you have like something blocked in your internal vCluster that is blocked by network policy, and that turns out it's something that's blocking by the host cluster? Is there like ways to make this debugging easier? Is it like the joining of two teams, or is there some way to self-diagnose these sort of problems?
It's a good question. So generally speaking, like the network policies for like an isolated vCluster is going to apply on that host cluster namespace. So from a network policy, things inside of the vCluster are all living in that namespace, and so they're going to be able to communicate anyway. With the caveat that we also support multi-namespace mode vCluster, where namespaces actually like get auto-generated to map one-to-one to in host clusters to vClusters, and then obviously we have some other things to consider. But generally speaking, network policy is pretty wide open in a vCluster. So you would really only need to care or think about it in a host cluster. Overgeneralization, but should work.
Yeah, I mean, there might be situations you run into where you need to talk to the platform team or something. That's probably going to come up at some point if they're the ones who own the underlying cluster. But in general, you should be able to get pretty much what you want from the virtual cluster.
Right. So probably a focus of maybe the platform team doing their network policy design and keeping in mind tenants and rolling that out in a sane manner.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. I see a question here. Do you need to use vCluster command, or can you access everything via kubectl?
Yeah. So two things there to deploy. You can use vCluster CTL, or you can use Helm, or you can use Loft. And then once you connect to that API server, then you can use whatever you want. K9s, kubectl. You can obviously, like I was using vCluster Connect to just send in commands ad hoc without necessarily having an ingress. So lots of ways to do it. But like once you're connected to that API server, it's just a regular API server. So however you want to interact with it, go crazy.
Gotcha. I think I'm getting the trend here when it comes to behaves just like a normal Kubernetes cluster.
That's definitely the goal, right? Like, and that's why we did the certified Kubernetes distribution thing with the CNCF. We wanted to really make sure that this thing was pretty much just Kubernetes. There's always edge cases, and we run into people who contact us about things. If you ever do see something super weird, definitely open a GitHub issue or come to the Slack or something. But in general, it should work like any other Kubernetes. I even use it locally sometimes, I use Docker Desktop a lot locally, and it takes me like 5 minutes to rebuild my Docker Desktop VM if something goes wrong, whereas I can delete and create a new vCluster in just a few seconds. So, there's, I think, local use cases, remote ones. It can be used for just about anything. The thing that I usually tell people is that, I think one of the biggest benefits is the speed thing. The fact that it's literally just deploying a pod. And so it just takes, often a few seconds to spin one of these things up. And if you think about, using EKS or something like that, where you're maybe going to be waiting 15 or 20 minutes to get your cluster, that's a really huge advantage. And, so if you're ever in a situation where you're like, oh, I wish I had this cluster now and didn't have to go take a coffee break, then that's maybe a good time to use vCluster.
Yeah, totally. I can see the speed, and I think the better bin packing resource usage. You spin up that new GKE cluster, you get that huge chunk of kube system that's running again, right? So
yeah,
that's a great point. And I think I'll end it off here with this last question from Archie. Sort of apart from multi-tenancy, where do you see vCluster going in the future? Like, where do you think it might go?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that, like I said, I think that a lot of the focus when we built it originally was on these ephemeral use cases, and I think that's probably the biggest difference that I've seen over the last year, is that we've started to see people using it, for more real things, for like, people building it into their products. I think there's at least one company out there that's probably, besides us, that's going to be offering like a vCluster hosting service of some kind, And so I think that is probably the next step for more people, to be using it in production environments where they really do care a lot more about, the workloads and things not being ephemeral.
Yeah, it's a good answer. And definitely, I think the productionization and seeing people use it will give people that confidence. And I think especially for the SaaS case, I definitely see a use case, and that's really exciting.
Yeah,
I mean, really
talk about all of the things we see, but
there's
a lot of cool use cases.
Yeah, there were actually a couple talks at the Kubecon that just happened from the CodeFresh folks. They did like 2 different talks where they talked about vCluster, and they do use it in their product. And the way that I saw one of those talks, and the way that they referred to it, it was like a sandbox, right? You're giving the different users a sandbox for these preview environments, and more isolation, I think, than if it was just namespace isolation. So yeah.
Exciting. Awesome. Well, once again, I want to thank Rich and Carl for an exciting hour, and thank you for staying past our end time of 1.
Oh yeah, of course.
Got the bonus value here. So I want to say again, express thanks from our community for joining, giving this talk. We'll post a recording and we'll share it around for those that weren't able to make it. And then I do want to mention again, we are thinking of meetups in person in our cities, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, in around mid-June time. So keep your eyes open for that. I've posted a link for the survey. This will be feedback for us, but also for Rich and Carl. And if you have any feedback for them, it'll make it to them there. Otherwise, there's a Linktree link for all of the CFP links and other things there. Subscribe there and you'll get our new link of postings. I'll post the recording there as well, so you can be notified. But once again, round of applause for Rich and Carl. And that's it. That's the April virtual meetup. Thanks for joining. And we'll catch you at the next one.
Hey, I just want to thank you guys real quick, because I've helped organize a meetup before, and I know it's a lot of work. So thank you for what you're doing and for having us on.
Well, it's a joint partnership. Our meetups are only as good as our speakers. So thanks again.